our discussions. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We are live from the fantastic Chabad Lubavitch Center for Jewish Life and Learning, if I may say so myself. I'm going to take a moment here to share this on various social media platforms, and we will be good to go. So give us a moment here. We're going to do our thing. Meanwhile, you guys have an opportunity to join, and we will get ready to roll. If you're not muted on Zoom, you should be. If not, I'm going to mute you. That's like my friend who was in summer camp. His father used to tell him his father was an anesthesiologist. Just because you guys said that Linda's about to join right now, he was an anesthesiologist. He used to tell his kid, either you go to sleep or I'm going to put you to sleep. So there you go. Linda's here. Good evening, Linda. The girls asked me where you are, and I said, I don't know. And then you showed up. It was like you heard them. Good evening, Danielle. Good evening, Wendy. I'm going to mute you, and we're going to go weiter. Here we go. So we are live on Facebook. We're live on Zoom. We're live on YouTube. I am not live on TikTok. Is that what it's called? TikTok. TikTok. I always mix up a TikTok and TikTok. So it's TikTok. I am not live there. Actually, I don't want to ever be there, dead or alive. Let's hope it stays that way. We are going to begin tonight. It is Parshas Va'eschanan. It is a parsha you can't beat. It's a parsha that has the 10 Commandments and it has the Shema in one parsha. So normally it's hard to keep up with the parsha on a good day, but when you have the Shema and the first chapter of Shema and the 10 Commandments and so much else, it's a lot to keep in touch with. But we're going to do our best to tap into a very interesting perspective that I think will be very helpful in our service of Hashem. So in the Shema, so we're going to use the Chumash that we use every week, the Light Chumash, and page 1101, where it has the Shema. So in the Shema Prayer, in the first chapter, it says, love God, your God, with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. These words, which I am commanding you today, shall be upon your heart. Teach them thoroughly to your students who are like your sons. Speak of them when you sit down in your house and when you walk on the way, when you lie down and when we lie down and when we get up. And then it talks about tefillin, that you should bind them on your arm and on your head, and then about mezuzahs. But the focus I'd like to focus on tonight is this verse that we say consistently and constantly, V'shinantam levanecha v'dibarta bam. You shall teach them thoroughly to your sons. Speak of them when we sit in our house and we walk on our way, when we lie down and when we get up in the morning. So there's actually two mitzvahs that we learn from this verse. There's the mitzvah of reciting the Shema every morning and every evening. That's what it refers to when we recite, when we lie down and when we get up. But the other mitzvah that is included in this verse is the mitzvah of Talmud Torah, the mitzvah of Torah study. We're going to get to the basics, but not just the basics. I think the word Torah study is thrown around in so many contexts. Everyone uses it. And sometimes it's misused. Sometimes it's abused. Sometimes it's on purpose. Sometimes it's by mistake. Sometimes it's because of ignorance. Sometimes it's deliberate. But we need to understand what is the obligation of Torah study and why in Jewish law does it present itself a certain way. Now, in the mitzvah, it's called the Mitzvah of Talmud Torah, studying Torah. There are two aspects. There's Lilmoid, the obligation that we have, right, to when we have the ability to learn Torah, and Lilamed, to learn Torah with others, especially a father teaching their children. Both of those aspects, self-learning and learning with children and teaching others, are included in Mishinantam Levanecha. The question is, and the Rebbe, actually what I share with you tonight is primarily from two talks that the Rebbe gave in the winter of 1977 and in the summer of 1978. So it's a combination of talks. And the Rebbe uses the term Tzadavar Pella. It's a wonder that both Maimonides, the codifier of Jewish law, of Moshe ben Maimon, the Rambam, in the 12th century, and the Alter Rebbe, Reb Shneur Zalman of Liadi, the author of the Tanya, but also the author of his Code of Jewish Law some 250 years ago, both start the laws of Talmud Torah, the laws of Torah study, with the words Not that you should learn Torah, but that you have an obligation, a biblical obligation, to learn with your young children. Makes no sense. First of all, practically, in order to teach your children, you need to learn. If you're not going to be able to teach your children properly, if you're not learning, if an ignorant person is teaching their children, God help us all. Right? You need to be learned in order to teach. So that's number one. Number two, seemingly, we're talking about teaching children. Children are young. Right? They're not necessarily obligated in all the mitzvahs yet. Actually, they're necessarily not obligated in most mitzvahs. So you want to say that teaching the children is more important than learning yourself? I get it if you want to include them, but why start the law? Both Maimonides and the Alter Rebbe start their law with teaching the children before you teach others. Now the Rebbe says there are two reasons you could try to use to explain this, and the Rebbe is clear that he's not too happy with either explanation, but he, for the sake of understanding it, he gives both options. Number one, when do you actually start learning? When you're a child. So we're trying to help a person understand that chronologically, when are they going to actually start learning, age-wise, when they're children. So the obligation to teach children starts first because that's when people start learning. So it goes by the age of the student of Torah, not by the father-child relationship in Torah study. Secondly, there's many, many times in the Torah where it talks about this importance of learning Torah. There's many verses that refer to it. But over here, this verse says specifically, V'shinantam livonecha, you will teach your sons, you will educate your children. And because it emphasizes that particular line in the Shema, so in the code of Jewish law, they mention the children before the adults learning themselves because the verse actually mentions the children. So the Rebbe says, okay, you win that one. It mentions children, and children, people start their childhood first before they become adults, and that's the order of things. It makes sense. But then the Rebbe says, then I'm going to turn the tables. I'm going to ask you another question. Why is the emphasis in the Shema on educating children? Right? Like, why on children? What's the big whoop? You want to tell people Torah is important? I get it. You want to tell people that teaching children is vital? Obviously, education. We all could agree that that's where it starts. Most people who do not have a good Jewish experience as adults is because as children they didn't have that, and they never rectified it, so they were stuck with whatever that miserable childhood experience was as it relates to Judaism. So we all can agree that education is important, and we have to educate our children. But is it more connected to a child than to an adult? In other words, the obligation to incorporate the values and teachings of Torah, is it superior with a child than with an adult? And you could try to say that, there's this great mystical explanation that, it says that when Mashiach comes, right, hear me out on this one, that it says when Mashiach comes, we're going to be, it says, Yiyu pnuyim b'Torah b'chachmasa. We're going to have free time to delve into the Torah and its wisdom. And it says, Yiyu Yisrael chachamim gdolim, the average Jew will be a great sage. Mala aretz day, the world will be filled with the knowledge of God. Tar b'hadeya v'achacham v'emes, the world will be filled with knowledge and with wisdom and with truth. And being that our learning of Torah then will be so elevated, so crystal clear, so refined, the clarity of Torah understanding when Mashiach comes will be so incredible that our Torah study today, we are almost all like children compared to the Torah study that we will do when Mashiach comes. So you could say that, and that everything we do now is really just the prep work to really understand Torah when Mashiach comes. But the Rebbe says, I'm sorry, but that's with all mitzvahs. Everything we do today is inferior to what it's going to look like when Mashiach comes. Because the clarity and the purity and the lack of agendas and the lack of our own internal issues will be we won't have that anymore. So doing a mitzvah and learning Torah will be incredible when Mashiach comes. But that's not just learning Torah, that's everything. Because it says we'll do mitzvahs ritzaynecha, we'll fulfill God's commandment as God wished us to do it with completeness. Therefore, everything we do today, according to one of the medrash, it says everything today is like tziyunim. It's like a symbol compared to the ultimate experience which will be when Mashiach comes. So then why is the emphasis specifically as it relates to Torah study in children? There obviously is something here as it relates to Torah study and children. Let me just let someone in. Someone's a few minutes late, but let him in. So there obviously is a reason for that emphasis. You know, I shared once on Rosh Hashanah that one of the great Torah scholars once said that when he davens, have a mispal daza tinoik, that he pray with the mind of a child. He would always ask God, he would hope that his own prayers would be that he would be able to pray, but that his prayers would also be received like a child's prayer. There's something very, very pure, something very, very beautiful about a child's prayer and their relationship with God, because their relationship with God is more innocent and more pure, right? And we could say all the jokes in the world about children. There are very good jokes about, children mailing letters to God, etc. But it's more than just that. There's an incredible, if you've ever tuned into the prayer of a child, right? And if many children don't allow it, but if a child ever let you into their personal prayers of what they want to pray for, it is the most beautiful thing you'll ever experience. So what the Rebbe shared in this talk in 1978, 77, was that the reason the focus, V'shinamtem levanecha, the reason why when it comes to Torah study, the emphasis is so much on the child, both in the code of Jewish law. The first thing we're told is that the obligation is to teach the children, and that it's based on a verse in the Shema from all of V'shinamtem levanecha. It doesn't say anything about learning yourself. We have to figure that out. In order to teach children, you got to learn. But the focus is on the children, because it's not just about the actual physical, biological children in your life. It's not just about your students, those who are young in your life that you have the ability to create an impressionable effect on with Torah study. It's about you looking at Torah, us looking at Torah from a child perspective. And what the Rebbe says is as follows. When it comes to doing mitzvahs, when it comes to fulfilling God's commandments, there's an objective there's what's called in halachic terms, and if you've never heard this, welcome to the world of yeshiva, because in every yeshiva, you'll hear students throwing these two terms around very often. There's gavra and chefza. There's the person doing the mitzvah, and there's the chefza, there's the object with which they're doing the mitzvah. And the goal when we do a mitzvah is to get the job done. That the gavra, the person, should take that chefza, that item, and do it. Of course, we say Asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu. God commanded us and sanctified us, and the goal is obviously to do the mitzvah with incredible bittul, recognizing that what I'm about to do is God's will, and therefore I want my involvement and my understanding of the mitzvah to be top notch. Nevertheless, as much as that's important when you do a mitzvah, at the end of the day, if you did the mitzvah without the proper intent, if you did the mitzvah without having all the spiritual focus, you still fulfill the mitzvah. It's a last resort. It's not the best way to do it, but it is absolutely getting a mitzvah done. So the bittul, the nullification to God, the subservience to God, the recognition that this is all about God is vital when it comes to a mitzvah, but the mitzvah can still be fulfilled even if for whatever reason the bittul wasn't there. Now let's contrast that with Torah study. Torah study is all about using your intellect. You need to use your intellect to understand the wisdom of God. But what we're really asking you is, hey, when you study Torah, I want you to move your intellect away from the subject. Your opinion is not relevant. If God wanted your opinion, he'd probably ask you. When you come to study Torah, you open up a book, you open up a sefer, you open up a chumash, you open up a book of Navi, you open up a Talmud, and your job is to take your intellect, the intellect that God gifted you, and utilize it to understand the godly wisdom embedded in the Torah. And the only way to do that properly is if you have bittul. Because what happens when you try to study Torah without being totally subservient to God is you could, God forbid, in the terms of halacha, you could end up being the worst enemy of Judaism and Torah because you're teaching Torah the wrong way, because you mixed your intellect into God's wisdom. So you need to use your incredible gifts of intellect, but only to understand the godly wisdom without mixing your opinion, your agenda, your way of seeing things. That's why it says they had to be berchu b'Torah tchila, that the Jews have to make a blessing and hope that when they go to study Torah, they have to remember v'nasan lanu et Torah that God gave us His Torah. It's His wisdom. It's God's infinite wisdom that He gave us the great gift of being able to try to comprehend, but don't ever do it without bittul, because then you're in trouble. Not only that, not only as an introduction, but when you're actually doing it, right, with a mitzvah, you're getting the job done. Right? When you put on tefillin, take an example of tefillin for men. What kind of side agenda could you have in putting on tefillin? You're wrapping yourself up in a bunch of weird-looking boxes. What exactly could you be? Yeah, maybe a little bit to show off, but really, I mean, from all the things I've seen people show off, wrapping up in tefillin has never been one of them. When you're lighting Shabbos candles, what kind of agenda could you have other than wanting to light Shabbos candles? It's very hard when you're doing a mitzvah, right? Even if you're not totally nullified to God and all spiritual and feeling holy, it's very hard to really mix your own agenda. Move into the world of Torah study where it's you get to share intellectual ideas. And I can tell you this as a Torah teacher, it is a very fine line from when you're sharing God's ideas to where, hey, I think, and boom, that's where you lost it. I think, what do you think? You could say, I understand, I perceive, I'm trying what I think. The minute it's I think, meaning it's not about God's wisdom anymore, it's your own agenda that you've created off of God's wisdom, which, by the way, you're just a freeloader because you're taking God's wisdom and trying to build your own business with it. That's where you have a very, very big danger, where bittul really has to come into place. By the way, that's why it says that you have to be so careful with Torah when you're arguing a Torah discussion, right? How much is really about Torah? And at what point do you get so upset at the person arguing the other point in Torah that it's about your ego already? Right? In the words of the Talmud, you think the Torah is making you infuriated? It's not the Torah. Because if it's really about Torah, you'd be happy to have a student or a colleague sitting across the table from you, having a great, healthy debate to understand God's wisdom. But if you're getting infuriated, then obviously it's not about God's wisdom anymore. It's about your ego. And don't try to sell me that you're getting angry for God. He doesn't need your favors. He has enough people that are angry for him. He doesn't need you to be joined. There's people who walk around the whole day claiming they're angry for him, and they and it's not what God wants of you. And therefore, when it comes to Torah, it's so important to remember bittul. And what better way to remember bittul, right, than to introduce a child into the picture? And so, when we talk about how the Torah, specifically, it's biblical to educate a child. And we learn it from the words Vishinantam Levanecha that's included in this week's Torah portion in the Shema, because it's teaching us two very, very important aspects of bittul. First of all, when do we start teaching children? It says when they get to an age where they can really comprehend, but even according to some opinions, even when a child can start speaking, which is much younger than comprehension. Right? We all know people that can talk, but there's no comprehension. With children, there's comprehension and there's talking. So certainly when they reach the level of comprehension, we're obligated to teach them Torah, even though Torah is seemingly such a wise and incredible infinite wisdom, because a child from the soul level, from the purity of their soul, doesn't have those issues where they have to mix their intellect. When you look, by the way, if you ever study with a child, you learned that this year with Eli, when you learn with a child wants to hear what you have to say. And they're so accepting, not because they're dumb, not because they're gullible, because they're godly. You told them God's wisdom and you didn't ask them, by the way, what's your opinion? By the way, there are days, I just want to clarify, I don't want anyone to think I'm some kind of holy guy. There are days that I wish God would consult with me. I have some ideas that I kind of think would be good. He doesn't, because I'm not God, and God doesn't do consultations. So when we think about a child, number one, the child accepts what they're taught without mixing their intellect. But second is that they're also capable of using their learning ability to try to understand someone else's intellect, in this case, God's intellect, without mixing in. So when we talk about our Torah study, how do we want to study Torah? Do we want to study Torah like an adult or like a child? Of course, like a child. Not because we want to be childish or ignorant or, gullible or be a human being that lacks full frontal lobe capability of really understanding anything. No, we want to learn like a child because the child brings such an aspect to bittul that only a child can have. And if we could try to emulate that somewhat, we'd be doing ourselves a favor, which is why, interesting, everything's divine providence. And in Chabad, we learn ethics of our fathers, Pirkei Avot, throughout the summer, till Rosh Hashanah. And in the year that the Rebbe shared this, in 77, 78, Parshat Ve'etchanan, our Torah portion, Ve'eschanan, was the same time they were learning chapter 4 in Ethics of Our Fathers. We are in chapter 3. But then it was chapter 4. And in chapter 4, Pirkei Avot, our sages say something phenomenal. And if you want to see it inside, that's why I asked that. A siddur, in the siddur, it's on page 284. There's two things in the siddur from Pirkei Avot in chapter 4 that's phenomenally connected to what we just read. It's Mishnah 19 at the bottom of 284. So we're going to read 19 and the beginning of 20, and you'll understand the connection in literally a moment. Shmuel HaKatan says, so first of all, I just want you to pay attention. The guy's name was Shmuel, but his nickname was Shmuel HaKatan, Shmuel the small one. When your enemy falls, do not rejoice. And when he stumbles, let your heart not be glad, lest the Lord see and it will be displeasing to him and he will divert his wrath from him to you. Don't celebrate your enemy falling. God doesn't like it. It's an unpleasant reaction. It's not what Jews do. Second statement, Elisha ben Avuya said, he who studies Torah as a child, to what can he be compared? To ink written on fresh paper. And he who studies Torah as an old man, to what is he compared? To ink written on paper that has been erased, used paper. So if you learn Torah when you're old, it's like someone writing on used paper. When you learn Torah when you're young, it's like someone learning Torah when they're a child, or someone writing on a paper that's new. So the Rebbe says, I'm a little confused. Well, trying to understand. I get why you're trying to encourage people to learn as children, because that's like paper, new paper. But what do you gain by saying the other half? Learning Torah when you're old is like writing on old used paper. Is that supposed to be an encouragement to older people to learn Torah? What do you want them not to learn because they didn't have a chance when they were younger, so let's just not learn at all? The Rebbe says something about that doesn't make sense. The book of Pirkei Avot, the chapters, the six chapters of Pirkei Avot are meant to be inspiration, not meant to be disparaging. And what does that tell old people? So the Rebbe says it's not talking about old people and young people. It's talking about two forms of learning. There's learning as a child, and there's learning as an adult, as an older person. Learning as a child means learning with bittul, like a child, without your agenda involved. So if you learn Torah like a child, without your agenda, where you come in with an open mind to try to grasp and understand the incredible infinite wisdom of God, then it's like writing on a new piece of paper. It will stick because you came into it seeking the wisdom of God. But if you come into learning Torah like an old sage who thinks he knows it all, or she thinks he knows it all, and therefore there's not a lot of bittul, it's all about you and what you're trying to accomplish with it, then of course it's going to be like writing on newspaper. By the way, you could be age-wise, you can be very young. If you're learning Torah without bittul, you're going to have the same problem. Which brings us to the statement of Shmuel HaKatan. I love this. Shmuel HaKatan says that when your enemy falls, do not rejoice. Right? Sounds like a beautiful teaching. But what's the problem with this teaching? Shmuel HaKatan lived after the destruction of the Second Temple. So, 2nd century, approximately CE. King Solomon, the guy who built the first temple, so about 900 years before Shmuel HaKatan, in his book of Proverbs, in his book of Mishlei, says the same thing. When your enemy falls, don't be rejoiced. Don't rejoice. So I need Ethics of Our Fathers to repeat a teaching that already exists 900 years earlier in the book of Mishlei, in the book of Proverbs. So the Machzor Vitri, one of the Medrashas, says as follows, that King Solomon was talking about worldly issues in business, in war. When you see your enemy, your competitor, when you see others making, the people that you dislike or are your business competitors or literal enemies, and you see them falling, don't rejoice. But when we're talking about here in Ethics of Our Fathers, is when it comes to Torah debates. And two guys are studying Torah, and each have a different opinion, and they're both using the logic of God's wisdom to get to their conclusion. And then there's a halacha, meaning one side eventually beats the other, and the accepted halacha becomes according to one, not the other. So let's say Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel argue, and eventually the halacha in those cases like Beis Hillel. Right, now you're a member of the yeshiva of Hillel, and you look at Shammai's guys and go, we beat you. That's what Shmuel HaKatan is warning. Why? Because you might think, and here's a tricky one, you might think that because you're talking about Torah, I have a right to rejoice. Because by that person losing and the halacha going according to me, I'm bringing victory to God. We now have a ruling the way God wants us to rule, and therefore there should be a lot of joy involved with the other person failing, because obviously they didn't get God's wisdom. They didn't understand God's wisdom. And I, in my righteous indignation on behalf of God as his permanent attorney, believe that I am very gracious and happy that I beat this dude because I didn't want, God forbid, their opinion, which is so horrible that the halacha isn't like them to come into play. But that's so wrong. Because just because the halacha is like one side and not the other does not mean that the other side is not Torah. There's many, many ways of understanding Torah. And even though eventually there is halacha, and there's something very beautiful about the fact that in Judaism, we have a way of life. It's a guide of how we do it. Doesn't mean that the opinion that is based on God's wisdom, there is room in God's wisdom for two sides of the coin. So don't rejoice, don't celebrate their fail, because it's not really a fail. It's a misguided way of seeing that as a fail, and they're not your enemy. And how do we know that? Because the author, the one that said that, his name is Shmuel, but his nickname was HaKatan, the small one. Why was he called Shmuel HaKatan? The Jerusalem Talmud tells us he was called HaKatan because he was maktin as atzmai. He would always humble himself. When you go into study and you're really seeking the truth, you would never be celebrating someone else's demise. Because you would recognize that within the realm of truth, in order to get to the truth, there's a process that has to go through. We're sure one guy is going to have the ultimate halacha and the other won't, but it's a process that gets us there, and every part of that process is as godly as it comes. And that's why if you look at the term, it says here that God may see what you're doing by being joyous for the other person's fail, and God will get upset, and he'll move his anger from them to you, right? Think about that. What anger does God have towards the other person that he could remove it from them to you? And here's an important thing. Sometimes the reason that one person merits to get it right, to understand the godly wisdom for which the halacha is, and the other doesn't, is because that other person may have done something in their life to create a little anger, a little bit of rage in God's eyes, and therefore they didn't have the schus. They didn't have the merit to be the one to grasp the godly wisdom. But guess what? If you get excited, right? If you get excited because they failed, God says, I actually feel a little bad that I didn't let this guy get the right answer, right? The right perspective. So then God says, let me transfer that. This guy looks a little too arrogant. He's feeling way too good about himself, even though it's my wisdom. His job was just to discover it. It's God's wisdom. It's not this person. It's not like he came up with the idea, right? No one sat down and said, let's have a discussion about the 4 cups of wine on Pesach, and then I'm going to take credit for the idea. No. You're having a discussion to fully understand what God wanted. And this guy thought you should have X amount of cups, and you said 4 cups, and for whatever reason, through the consensus of the sages, you win the debate. Don't get cocky. Don't get all excited to the point that you make the other feel bad, because God says, I don't like that either. And not just in the realm of war and business and interpersonal behavior, but even in Torah study, where you think you're defending God, stand back. Don't allow arrogance to get involved. Don't allow yourself and your own agenda and your own self-aggrandizement to get involved, because it won't work with Torah. It will be like writing on a used piece of paper, which is not very successful, because you're not coming into it with the bittul of a child. That is why all of our Torah study, both adult and children, is based on the verse that says, teach your children, because all of us need to be learning with the purity and the innocence and the acceptance and the bittul of a child. By the way, children can be bullies. Children can be a lot of things. Children are not naturally arrogant. They don't have enough going for them yet to be arrogant. The only children you'll ever meet that are arrogant are ones whose parents prop them up and make them, you're going to be the best ice skater and you're the super best skier. By the way, my kids are none of that. The 2 of them are sitting right here. They're good skiers. They're good hikers. They're good wall climber. What's it called? Not wall climber, huh? Rock climbers. They're not the best in the world. They're not. Maybe they will be. They're not. And it's a great enough thing to tell your child the truth, that they're amazing. Just you don't know if they're the best. So when you prop up a child so much so that they become arrogant about it, that's when you see arrogance. Otherwise, children are not naturally arrogant. They should have a good self-esteem, but not arrogance. Adults, that's where the ego kicks in. So the Shinantam Levanecha, the Shema, is telling us, teach children, but also study Torah like children. That's why the Rambam and the Alter Rebbe both codified their Jewish law. Hilchos Talmud Torah start with the obligation to teach children, because all of us need to learn that way. And then we will have the great merit to learn the way Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. You know what it says? That after Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, the yeshiva of Hillel and the yeshiva of Shammai finished debating a subject, and then halacha was rendered. What did they do? It says in the Talmud, in Yevamos, it says they would show each other extra love and extra endearment. They went out of their way to show more kindness, endearment, and love to the other, because they knew that at that moment, that's what was needed most. I don't know if you guys saw, I saw it on Twitter, and Baruch Hashem, most of you are not on Twitter, so maybe you didn't see it, but there was an incredible video that happened at I believe it was Oklahoma, at a Little League baseball game. Just this week, where the pitcher misfired when he pitched. You saw it? He hit the batter straight in the face with the ball. The batter, it's an incredible scene, because these obviously teenagers, it's Little League. The batter falls to the floor. He falls pretty harsh, but then the pitcher is like standing at the mound, and I couldn't tell if he was crying or he was beside himself for what he did. And eventually, when the batter got back to himself, he walked up to the pitcher and calmed him down and spoke to him and almost consoled him, telling him it's okay. It was, You saw it, right?
Yeah. Well, something of it.
Oh, you should see the end. That's the whole point. You just watched the part where he got zetzt. You know? It was a good ending, and I think that's what it's about. Where's the bittul? Where's the consolation when you know that there was a good heated debate of Torah, but no one here? It's not about us. I once years ago, many years ago, and I'll conclude with that. Most rabbis probably wouldn't say this on a broadcast, but I am, because I think it's always good to use personal experience. This must be 9 years ago, 10 years ago, when our mikveh was still new. And when a woman uses the mikveh, the filter must be off, because otherwise the water is rotating and doesn't have the halachic ramifications that it needs for a mikveh. And someone was going to use the mikveh on one of the 2-day holidays, and somehow I forgot to turn the filter off. and they used the mikveh, and the next morning after they used the mikveh, I realized that the filter was on. Now here we're talking about, from a Jewish law perspective, in the most strict of laws, husband and wife being with each other after the mikveh. This is the top of the line. And the entire second day of Yom Tov, I had services and I had a meal, and the rest of the afternoon I sat in my library because I couldn't call a rabbi to consult. I sat in my library going out of my mind, going through every responsa of Rav Moshe Feinstein and of other halachic poskim, great halachic authorities. And about 3 or 4 hours in, I found an answer for Rav Moshe Feinstein, specifically about a case where a woman used the mikveh when the filter was on. And his response was something to the effect that if they were not standing directly across where the water comes out of the filter, they were standing in a different part of the mikveh, where the water is not actually directly being rotated, they have fulfilled the mitzvah in a last, under the circumstances, b'di'evad, what it's called, and under that reality. And it was somewhat of a comfort, because in our case, that's what happened. But until Yom Tov ended, until I can get a rabbi on the phone that knows these laws, as an expert, and I got Rabbi Farkash on the phone after Yom Tov, it was tormenting. It was tormenting. So when we sit and discuss Torah, and we try to understand the right thing to do, it's not about us. It's not about our ego. It's about making sure the proper law is being done, the proper guidance is understood, the proper Torah interpretation is grasped. And if we can stick to that and keep our egos out of it, and it's all about understanding, like a child, just about understanding the beauty of God's wisdom, our world and our Torah world would obviously have very little infighting, which is something we desperately need. There's no need for infighting. But also the way we approach Torah with such bittul would be a great introduction for the ultimate learning of Torah, which will be when Mashiach comes in. As we said in the beginning, that will be the ultimate purity in our learning of Torah, the ultimate clarity in our learning of Torah. And a great prep for that was if we can increase our clarity now, which happens through getting ourselves out of the picture and focusing on the author of the Torah, the one who composed this great song of life called the Torah, and that is Almighty God. May we merit to be incredible students of Torah. May we merit the next 6 weeks to Rosh Hashanah. Habibi, did you hear that? 6 weeks to Rosh Hashanah. I don't want to hear it, but it is. Huh?
Later this year.
I don't know. It's always on the 1st of Tishrei. I don't know if it's later or earlier. I know what you meant. But that our preparation for Rosh Hashanah should include a lot of Torah study and a lot of introspection of how we learn Torah. Keep our egos out of it, our souls in it, purity of a child, so that when we hear the shofar, which is the cry of a child, of a baby, we should be in that mode of ready to serve God like an innocent, pure child of God. Have a wonderful evening. Have a super fantastic Tu B'Av. It's coming up. I think Tu B'Av is on Friday. Tu B'Av, the 15th of Av, which is the great holiday. You want to know more about that? I gave a class about it a couple years ago, but if you email me or text me, I'll send you a link. You can learn all about the holiday. It's not a holiday that we have special meals for, although this year it's going to be Friday, so we'll have a great Friday night meal. But right, a super big Friday night. But have a wonderful Shabbos, a wonderful Tu B'Av, and we'll see you back here, God willing, next week. Sei gesund. And I'm signing off from Facebook, but if you're on Zoom and you have a question.
Isn't that the tree holiday? Hi, Linda. I can't hear. Linda's muted.
She's muted. Hold on, let me.
47 people Shabbos there.
All these tourist geniuses.
In the summer trips.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Easy.